Welcome to the Republican Professor. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Welcome back. It's 5 February 2026 years after Jesus. It's a Thursday. We're back in a discussion of The Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell, subtitle America Since the 60s. Published by Simon and Schuster Publishers, 2020. Wonderful read. We have stopped in our consideration of the chapter on sex at this subsection called The Feminine Mystique and Male Sexism on page 42. Last time, which was, I believe, in December, might have been in November that I recorded it back at the Guyvit pad. Yeah, that would have been the day after Thanksgiving, so Friday of Color, 2025. We started the chapter on sex, which Christopher Caldwell has is his chapter 3. We covered the GI generation and its failures. I got to take a drink of green tea. Hold on. And so we're continuing our discussion. We're going to do a fair use to a transformative reading of this material. Go out and get a copy of The Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s by Christopher Caldwell. It's a wonderful book. You need to have it on your bookshelf. He's one of my favorite writers in American politics, and you're not going to be disappointed. You got to follow along. Get a copy of it. I don't care if you get it used. I'm sure Chris Caldwell does, but get a copy of it. Support quality publishers and quality writers. Okay, we're on page 42, Feminine Mystique and Male Sexism. As surely as World War II had advanced the integration of blacks, so-called blacks, I'm going to add, told you it's a transformative reading. I'm going to add my own stuff here. All right. Into the mainstream of American academic and work life, it had reversed the integration of women. Now, we're assuming we know what women are, right? Am I right or am I right? Or am I right or am I right or am I right? The war done, women were shunted from the jobs they had filled to make way for the returning heroes. Between 1920 and 1958, women went from a third of college students to a quarter. The GI Bill put universities at the service of millions of demobilized veterans. However storied its contributions to the smooth reintegration of American fighting men, the bill, that is the GI Bill, was one of the greatest impediments to working women ever erected. The boom of the 1950s wound up affecting the sexes in different ways. Men became titans of, or at least soldiers in, the industrial economy. Their women were left stranded in empty houses full of high-powered cleaning machinery. This had never been their lot before. Well, I would say, Chris, don't misunderestimate, to quote George W. Bush, the convenience of high-powered cleaning machinery and, air conditioning. Kind of nice for the first time in world history to have such things. Today, The Feminine Mystique, which is a book, the book title, reads like a collection of magazine articles, exciting, insightful, grippy, gripey, I should say. It's hard to say exactly what it is about as a whole. Friedan, that's the lady that wrote it, blamed women's tendency to place their womanliness before their humanity. She spoke of a problem that has no name and called women's predicament a sexual one. But there are many meanings of sexual. It could describe the civil disadvantages a woman later labored under because of her gender, her role in the typical American family structure, or a whole range of erotic questions. Friedan meant a bit of all three, but it would be a decade before the society began to grapple with such distinctions. Page 43 at the top of The Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s by Christopher Caldwell, published by Simon & Schuster, 2020. Go out and get your copy today. We'd like to thank Christopher Caldwell for writing this, and we'd like to thank Simon & Schuster for making this material available. Support your local bookstore. Americans groped their way only slowly toward an understanding of what a liberated woman was. Everyone, no matter what his viewpoint, understood the stakes of civil rights. But the public didn't get women's lib. In 1968, the Philip Morris Tobacco Company brought out Virginia Slims, a brand that could pitch cigarette smoking as a component of emancipation underway. Quote, "You've come a long way, baby," unquote, was its motto. With a financial stake in figuring out what women yearned for, and just as important, claimed to yearn for, the brand sponsored frequent polls. In October 1971, it asked women how often they felt that, quote, "being a woman has prevented me from doing some of the things I had hoped to do in life," unquote. Only 7% said frequently. 12% said occasionally. 79% said hardly ever. Wow. You see why I like Chris Caldwell? Did you know that? I didn't know that. As for what women thought of feminists, the results were chastening. 22% respected the journalist Gloria Steinem versus 4% who did not. But 65% had never heard of her. 63% had never heard of the author Germaine Greer, and 64% had never heard of the theorist Kate Millett. For most women, the, quote, "problem that has no name," unquote, was not a problem. During the Kennedy administration, polls showed no attitudinal gap of any kind on any important issue between married and unmarried women. 90% of married women and 87% of unmarried believed in the existence of a superior, quote, "women's intuition," unquote. 16% of married women thought it was excusable in some circumstances to have an extramarital affair versus 15% of unmarried women. 50 years later, married and unmarried women would disagree about almost everything. The conditions for women's lib, not yet ripe in the 1960s, would be more favorable a decade later. Bureaucratic and judicial procedures first worked out to punish civil rights violations. Let me start that sentence again. Bureaucratic and judicial procedures first worked out to punish civil rights violations would by then have been analogized into remedies for other grievances. In the 1970s, a generation of women would come of age who could take advantage of them, not having already wagered, page 44 at the top, their unhappiness on a traditional mating and family forming system. Universities grew, and I'm sighing, admitted more women, man, and insulated a critical mass of elite women from child rearing expectations. It was they who would mobilize against, quote, "sexism." unquote. I'm going to take another sip of green tea. I'm going to mute it. All right. I got my green polka dot tie on with a yellow pastel shirt, 100% cotton, and then this kind of off-white pasty jacket on, which I'm not sure what this jacket is made. I think it's silk. Does that make me sound like a gangster? Well, most of my jackets are wool, but I don't think this is wool. It's a different texture. It's got that light, you know, summer Newport, Rhode Island feel to it in the 1920s. If you know, you know. I'm not even sure I know what I'm talking about, so feel free to disregard anything I say. All right. Page 44 at the top. The word, that's the word sexism, did not exist when Friedan's book came out. It was coined in 1968. See, I didn't know that. It was coined in 1968 by the writer Carolyn Bird, who had enrolled at Vassar in 1935. Okay, there we go. There we go, Vassar. She was in college 3 years before Friedan, then Betty Goldstein went to Smith. Sexism, Bird wrote, is judging people by their sex where sex doesn't matter. It is an admirably simple definition, reminiscent of the definition of racism that were current, definitions of racism that were current before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But it reveals the perennial political difficulty of feminism, which is that sex often matters and matters more than anything. It is fundamental in a way that race or class is not. Men don't carry babies. Oh, really? Oh, really, Chris? Well, anyway, don't you love these old school Democrats? Don't you love them? Men don't carry babies. Let's bring these Democrats back. I miss them. I miss them. Feminism had to contend not just against bigotry, but also against nature. Faced with the scale of their project, feminists showed an ambivalence that besets them even today. Was this a call to order, or was it a movement of liberation? Was sex supposed to matter less or more? Did women want to fend off men or engage them in a freer, more, quote, male, unquote, culture of sexuality? I left off a word, sorry. Did women want to fend off men or engage them in a freer, more male culture of sexuality? Men took feminism as a straightforward indictment, and I know it's indictment. Okay, I know. But why spell it like that if that's how you're supposed to say it? Of their own attitudes. Men took feminism as a straightforward indictment of their own attitudes. They were right to. Sexism, as Bird defined it, was everywhere. The succinct explanation that the New York Times war correspondent David Halberstam gave in 1972 for the high quality work he and his fellow journalists had done in Vietnam was that there had been no women in their lives to mess things up. Quote, because only one of them was married, unquote, he wrote of his colleagues. Quote, there was no wifey pull to become part of the Saigon social whirl to get along with the Noltings or the Harkinsons, the kind of insidious pressure which works against journalistic excellence in Washington, unquote. On the bottom of page 44, I'm loving this. Women meant compromise and intellectual mediocrity, says Christopher Caldwell. Continuing, he says, if you asked women to name the quality they most admired in women, Intelligence ranks tops at 57%. If you asked men, the best thing about women was gentleness at 38%. Only 1% of them cited intelligence. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. I gotta take a drink of green tea, Chris. Hold on. Chris is a master political phenomenologist. Okay, in case you don't know, this is political phenomenology 101. Okay, this is what he's doing. He's describing the phenomena and he's just trying to get it accurate. Obviously, it's hard to do, especially when there's so much to describe, but I think he's doing an excellent job. Okay, so I'm continuing page 44. I don't need to reread that what I just read. um, it is obvious what the consequences of such attitudes would be in any man-run workplace. Page 44 at the top. Look at the TV commercial and marketing campaign at Eastern Airlines ran in the summer of 1967. Entitled Presenting the Losers, it announced that the company had hiring standards so rigorous that only 1 in 20 applicants for a job as stewardess was hired. Rather than describe those standards, it paraded a dozen young women across the screen and invited the viewer to check them out, accompanied by a narrator's contemptuous assessments. She's awkward, not very friendly. She bites her nails. She wears glasses. Oh, she's married. One is too tall, one too short, another chews gum. Eastern's standards were wholly physical, sexual. The feminine sexuality they reflected was preposterously, cruelly, pointlessly narrow. Yet, a woman who did not want to find herself left alone in life would do well to conform to it. Hmm. Quote, maybe the real you is a blonde, unquote, ran a 1966 magazine ad for Clairo product called Born Blonde. Quote, often a woman who looks merely pleasant with dark hair can be a beauty as a blonde. How about you? Unquote. Women's choices and options were of a demeaning and fetishistic kind. A 1968 ad for Hublin cocktails shows a man with 7 women. Each of them got up with erotic accoutrements. The socialite with the mink and the pearl choker, the sexy cleaning lady with the too short black and white French maid's outfit, the island woman with a bare midriff, the mannish woman in gaucho hat and high heels. They would all roll on a bed with you if you could just pour enough Hublin cocktails into them. Quote, everything to make it happen comes inside the bottle. Uncap the new free spirit in liquor, 17 uninhibited drinks from Hublin, all very strong on flavor, unquote. Page 45 at the bottom. You could see how such ads might render contact with the opposite sex so stupid, humiliating, and exploitative as to turn certain people off it altogether. Throughout the early years of women's lib, men's, quote, objectification, unquote, of women seemed to be its main underlying grievance. Male sexual desire demanded too much obedience and conformity from half the population, and that was leaving aside what it did to men. Both sexes needed to be liberated from it. Okay, we're on page 46, and um, the next subsection is called Playboy and Male Sexuality. And I would like to continue because I find this to be very interesting and kind of sad, actually. But it's before my time. I was not even a zygote during a lot of this, so I'm learning a lot too. And I've already read this. I mean, you probably here you can see you see the coffee stain. I mean, I I treat my books very well, but every once in a while you do something so stupid like put a coffee cup in a bag with a book. I thought the coffee mug, it was a travel mug. I thought it was screwed tight. Well, okay, then one of my favorite books has got a coffee stain on it. Now, it turns out it still works. It's a book, and this book means a lot to me because it was delivered October 30th, 2021 at 7:30. Matt Stone sent it to me. Matt Stone is a former political philosophy student I had in 2008 from Moorpark College. And thank you, Matt Stone, for providing this book, for this physical copy of mine. Go out and get your copy today of The Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s. Simon and Schuster and Christopher Caldwell wrote it. You want to get it, have to get your hands on this book. You got to follow along. It's really powerful. Okay, page 46 at the top. If that had been the real grievance, it would have been a logical thing for second wave feminism to ally itself, as first wave feminism had done, with those forces of prudery that had always worked to trammel or civilize male sexuality above all the churches. There were still, I don't know if I read that very well. Um, Above all the churches. Been lodged. Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, I think it's implying the churches did a good job, but there were still such forces at work in the early days of feminism. Until the mid 1960s, college dormitories were all single sex and parietal rules were enforced with suspensions and expulsions. They would not last long. By 1969, elite colleges were full of men and women copopulating, as Williams College t-shirt of the time, a Williams College t-shirt at the time put it. Feminists almost never allied with moral tradition. I don't think that was a good move there, feminists. You're going to want to draw from the moral well at some point. I'm going to take a drink of water. You know? You know what I mean, Vern? Feminists almost never allied with moral tradition. For all their outspoken misgivings about male sexuality, liberated women were on the side of more freer and better sex. Certainly, a large part of feminist aspirations was simply to live with the same freedom that men did. Barry Mann and Cynthia Wiles or Vales, I don't know how you say it. It's Getting Better, which Mama Cass Elliot made a hit in the summer 1969, was a renunciation of romantic feminine ideas about love. Here's a quote from, looks like the lyrics. Quote, once I believed that when love came to me, it would come with rockets, bells, and poetry. But with me and you, it just started quietly and grew. And believe it or not, now there's something groovy and good about whatever we got, unquote. Hmm. That's actually not a bad jingle. I mean, I think. In this telling, love and sex were not mysterious or irrational. They were natural and right. Trying to gird love round with conventions and roles had only cut people off from what was most true and noble about it. Now, this demystified, straightforward way of looking at sex had its own transgressive thrill. As a whisper can gain more attention than a shout, objectivity was more erotic than objectification. Bliss, when one encountered it, would be something like common sense. Page 47 at the top. There were a lot of reasons why, in the 1960s, eroticism seemed to overflow the levees of tradition. They included the prestige attached to manliness and even machismo in the wake of the Second World War, the bringing to market of an almost perfectly effective birth control pill in 1960, and with the baby boom, an unprecedented temporary concentration of people of sexually active age. What could go wrong? Sudden demographic spikes like the baby boom created shifts in power relations between the sexes. Men tend to marry, or in our day, pair up with, women on average 3 years or longer. Other things being equal, babies born at a time when the birth rate is still rising will come of age 2 decades or so later in a society where eligible women outnumber eligible men. Men can therefore drive a harder mating bargain. This means not just that individual men born into a baby boom get better mates than they deserve with quotations around it, but also that collectively the era's style of sexuality, of gender relations, will be more, quote, male, unquote. When the women outnumber men, they must compete for male favor by offering sex and companionship on male terms. This probably means more promiscuity and more out of wedlock births. The reverse is true too. When a society is in demographic decline, men outnumber the women they are most likely to marry or pair off with. As a consequence, more will be more female, unquote. Hmm. James Q. Wilson offered the example of female suffrage in the turn of the century United States. All the movement's prominent theorists and agitators were in the Northeast, but all 11 of the states that had given women the vote before World War I were in the West. Did you know that? I did. Where the male-female ratio, and therefore the male difference to women, was highest. Hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Huh. In the 1960s, okay, so the 1960s were as wildly skewed toward an excess of women as any period since the aftermath of the Civil War. In 1970, the ratio of unmarried white men, ages 20, I would just say so-called white men, ages 23 to 27, to unmarried so-called white women, I added so-called, ages 20 to 24 was 2 to 3. For blacks, and I would say so-called blacks, it was close to 1 to 2. However, however inevitable the sexual disruption of the 1960s and 1970s might have been, page 48 at the top, a variety of sexually enthusiastic and culturally influential men sought to promote it as, quote, sexual revolution, unquote, as if it had been somebody's brilliant idea, probably theirs. John Updike, Gore Vidal, Norman Mailer, for such novelists, the trend to more open sexual relations offered new opportunities in culture, art, and society. Hugh Hefner felt the same way. In 1953, he had founded the monthly Playboy magazine that included ample political and cultural coverage, but was known best for its color photo centerfolds of pneumatic nudes. Hefner envisioned the Playboy clubs that he set up in several American cities as outposts of a new culture. His Playboy mansion in Chicago, I didn't know it was in Chicago. Hmm. Shows, I mean, I've read this before. I guess I get something new every time. I mean, anyway, you forget things. Okay, so his Playboy mansion in Chicago resembled the airless, lightless, weatherless utopias of the spacecraft on Star Trek and Lost in Space. It had a basement pool with an underwater bar room where you could look up through the windows at naked swimmers. Hmm. It was, Hefner wrote, quote, a place where one could work and have fun without the trouble and conflicts of the outside world. Inside, a single man had absolute control over his environment. I could change night into day, screening a film at midnight and ordering a dinner at noon, having appointments in the middle of the night and romantic encounters in the afternoon. Being brought up in a very repressive and conformist manner, I created a universe of my own where I was free to live and love in a way that most people can only dream about. Unquote. Page 48 at the bottom. The bed, the most important item in the Hefner hedonist habitat, was circular. It rotated and vibrated next to a closed circuit TV system and all kinds of other gadgetry. The London designer Christopher Turner later compared it to an air traffic control tower. Quote, the headboard of his bed was crammed with the buttons and levers with which he controlled both his environment and his ever expanding empire. Unquote. When the journalist Tom Wolfe came for an interview, Hefner told him he hadn't been outside in 3.5 months. Jeez, man. This is pretty depressing. Jeez. All right. Page 49 at the top. Women's rights and male license were traveling on similar tracks. Imagine asking an average Playboy reader during the Johnson administration to dictate a new sexual constitution that would replace the old one. His preconceptions and practical demands on the oppressiveness of marriage, on the availability of birth control, on the desirability of mixing the sexes would likely have overlapped with those of feminism, even if the ideals in the name of which those changes were sought were alleged to differ. Yeah, they're all Democrats. In 1974, Virginia Slims found that women backed most of the efforts to strengthen and change women's status in society by a margin of 2 to 1. Okay. Okay. 57 to 26%. But that men backed them even more strongly by 3 to 1, 64 to 20%. Jeez. Did you know that? Playboy readers and other sexual revolutionaries now demanded from sex the name for the same variety, excellence, and convenience they had come to expect from their lives as consumers. That's insightful right there. That's very insightful. Nothing wrong with that as a goal, of course. The Englishman Alex Comfort, an admired poet and novelist in his youth, wrote a book called The Joy of Sex, A Gourmet Guide to Lovemaking, 1972. His conceit was that sex was exciting in the same way a really good meal was. And his book was organized like a menu, dividing into four sections: starters, main courses, sauces, pickles, and problems. Hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. How do they come up with this? The joy of sex was so hastily assembled that its early editions retain on the inside of an alternative subtitle, quote, a cordon bleu guide to lovemaking, unquote. That did not stop the book from selling 12 million copies. Jeez. In sex, as in coffee and beer, there was a trend toward connoisseurship. Billy Joel's 1977 song, Scenes from an Italian Restaurant, was a sad urban ballad about Brenda and Eddie, the popular steadies, and the king and the queen at the prom, who had foolishly married right out of high school, suddenly a low class thing to do. Here's a quote from the song. Quote, they got an apartment with a deep pile carpet and a couple of paintings from Sears. What's wrong with Sears? I love Sears. A big water bed that they bought with the bread they had saved for a couple of years. Unquote. Page 50 at the top. That is, they squandered on a sex aid the money that couples of their parents' generation might have socked away for a down payment on a house. A big water bed that they bought with the bread. Okay. You know, I missed that part about the water, but okay. Um, all right. Water beds, which around that time were marketed as a magical tool for intensifying sexual pleasure to a dizzying meta ecstasy, are here jammed together with two contemporaneous cliches of low status consumption: shag carpets and department store paintings, as if undue preoccupation with sexual enjoyment were a proletarian indulgence. But just as connoisseurship was seeping down through the class hierarchy, crude ways of talking about sex in public were percolating up. Magazine advertisements for Trojan Cling Tight Natural Lamb condoms depicted them in front of a decanter full of what looks like rosé and an ancient bound copy of Hippolyte Taine's History of English Literature. The touch of class, the ad, informed those who might be slow to get the point. People have always built their identities through choosing, or to use the old word, discriminating. On the other hand, feminism promised to give women access to the higher style of destiny defining choices that men had seemed to monopolize. As heads of families and as swashbuckling soldiers, executives, and politicians. On the other hand, it threatened to drag both sexes down to a world in which petty, phony baloney shopping decisions carried out to the din of TV marketing pitches were dressed up as matters of destiny and came to constitute the whole of one's identity. Wow. That's so good, Chris. Chris Caldwell, Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s, and Simon and Schuster. Get your copy today, published in 2020. One of my favorite writers, American politics. We'll go a little bit further today, okay? Gloria Steinem, Capitalism and Class. The journalist Gloria Steinem, Smith College, 1956, who on a journalist assignment in 1963 went undercover as a scantily clad Playboy club bunny, saw women's liberation as patterned on black liberation. What could go wrong? In 1969, 2 years before she founded Miss magazine, she wrote, quote, sex and race, because they are easy and visible differences, have been the primary ways of organizing human beings into superior and inferior groups and into the cheap labor on which the system still depends. We, the supporters of women's lib, Chris adds in there in brackets, are talking about a society in which there will be no roles other than those chosen or those earned, unquote. Page 51 at the top. If earning was at the center of second wave feminism, it is unsurprising that women's workplace fashions of the early 1970s were feminized male fashions. Skirt suits, high-heeled wingtips, scarves tied like bow ties. Women were being invited to, quote, join, unquote, the male world in the same way blacks of the civil rights era had been expected to, quote, join, unquote, the white one. And these are so-called blacks, so-called whites, so-called civil rights era, because the first Civil Rights Act, of course, was 1966, all Republicans. And of course, you know, the whole really movement goes way back before that. But we'll let that slide. I keep pointing this out. This proved no more possible for the one group than the other. In the 1970s, as feminism grew more strident and its program more ramified, it took on elements of illogic. It took on elements of illogic that had not been present in Friedan's original vision. Steinem, of course, attacked capitalism as a system dependent on, quote, cheap labor, unquote, and in the same breath enshrined it as the only legitimate source of values, quote, no roles other than those chosen or those earned, unquote. Feminism was locked from the start in an intimate relationship with technology, management, and the market system. The power of feminism rested on advances in contraception and abortion. Wow. And on the spread of civil rights principles out of government and into the corporate world. It was, in its essence, an ideology of the innovative, entrepreneurial, and managerial classes, an ally of technocracy, modernity, progress, so-called progress, and wealth. Feminists wanted to integrate the Metropolitan Club, not the Elks. Steinem the mocked, quote, the housebound matriarchs of Queens and the Bronx, unquote. She complained that, quote, to top it all off, the problem of servants or childcare often proves insurmountable after others are solved, unquote. And that this at a time well before mass immigration. Pay attention to that. Pay attention to that. This at a time well before mass immigration had reintroduced household servants into American upper middle class life. In the eyes of almost all men, women's liberation was not just by, but for women as Steinem, for such women as Steinem. It aimed at improving the position of women in the white collar work. But, okay, the question whether blue collar work, plowing, lifting, grinding, getting dirty, was appropriate to women, page 52 at the top, came up much less often than one might have anticipated. Partly feminists were blinded to it by their own social background, but in hindsight, we can see another explanation. The supply of well-paying blue-collar jobs had begun to shrink rapidly. It could not accommodate large classes of new entrants. The collapse of working and middle-class economic security was one of the defining conditions of feminism's development. Wow. I'm gonna I'm gonna mute it while I take a drink of water. All right, kids, you still there? Page 52. It was also a consequence. Workplace feminism exacerbated inequality. It increased the number of intra-class marriages, and it undermined the New Deal structure of the quote family wage unquote. The common sense assumption among Americans of all classes that a wage paid to a working man went to support his wife and children as well. In its imperfect way, the family wage had compensated the housewife for her unwaged work. Whether she got sufficient control over the part of the wage that she flat out earned is a separate intrafamilial question and potentially a genuine feminist grievance. Still, that's an interesting point, which pits Democrats against each other in different eras here, different decades, the 1930s versus the 1960s and 70s. Yeah. Hmm. That 40-year difference between the 1930s and the 1970s, the Dems are at war with each other here. Yeah. Okay. Still, at the time feminism arose, it wasn't much of a grievance. The Saturday Evening Post had asked its female readers at the height of the Kennedy administration, quote, would you like to see your husband work harder so that he could increase his income, unquote? Five-sixths, that's 83% of them responded no. Young Americans of the counterculture who insisted that middle class life ought to be about more than mindless striving may have thought they were assailing American values. They were actually expressing them. Feminism offered corporations an excuse. This right here is really sad. It's really sad, man. Feminism offered corporations an excuse, what the political philosopher Nancy Fraser called a legitimation for breaking the implicit contract to pay any full-time worker a wage he could raise a family on. It was feminism that provided, under pressure of the recessions of the 1970s, a pretext for repurposing household and national budgets. Instead of being used for reproduction, understood as both family forming and investment, those budgets would now be consumed. The increment in the family wage that had been meant for the raising of children was withdrawn. Families were no longer entitled to it. Mothers would have to enter the workplace to claim it. That's really sad. But they wound up getting only a small part of it, and their competition drove down their husbands' wages into the bargain. Wow, that's really sad. Page 53 at the top. Then we've been reading a political phenomenology and interacting and discussing this. A political phenomenology is what I'm calling it, which is what I think the strength of this writer is Christopher Caldwell, The Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s. I think this is a masterful political phenomenology of America, American politics. And it's worth careful attention and study. Get your copy today. The next subsection of the chapter, Sex, which is chapter 3, is called Roe versus Wade and the Supreme Court. We're going to get to that next time. We're going to discuss it next time. There's another subsection called Our Bodies, Ourselves. And let's see, that's the end of the. Oh, there's one more subsection called the Equal Rights Amendment, which we've covered a little bit on the podcast with Carol Felsenthal, the biographer of Bill Clinton. And what we talked about on the podcast was her biography, her excellent biography of Phyllis Schlafly. And anyway, this has been a very interesting time here. I've really enjoyed this time with you. Get your copy of Age of Entitlement. But guys, I'm asking you to get physical books that you can hold in your hand, you know, physical books that you can hold in your hand and, listen, you hear that? You hear the pages? There's no ads. You can spill coffee on this and you don't have to worry that it's not going to work. It still works, but I would say don't spill coffee on it. Kill some trees, people. Thanks for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. I've been your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. It's Thursday, 5 February 2026, years after Jesus. It's a Thursday. God bless you guys. We'll see you next time.